The Switch 2 was impossible to find during its first few months, is what I was prepared to say when the console first launched. But alas, it wasn't really that hard to find, even though every single sign pointed to supply issues. The success of the original console, the pre-orders going super fast, crashing sites, the state of global trade, Arcade Archive's Ridge Racer being available at launch, and even just Nintendo's reputation with console launches. Like, I was out camping with my friends at release and I saw how many people were there because they know what Nintendo does. Surely I was going to have to relive the message board era that I had when I was in grade 9 trying to get the Switch 1. But even when launch had long since passed, you could still go into an EB Games and they might have one or two there. Heck, they even had stock on their website within the first month. Why are things different this time around? Have Nintendo changed their tactics? Have they simply corrected past errors? In order to figure this out, let's look back at the history of Nintendo stock issues, why they occurred, and why the Switch 2 isn't really having them. It's impossible to talk about Nintendo and stock issues without talking about the scarcity principle. Or in layman's terms, people want what they can't have. I have no desire to own a penny farthing, but tell me someone else wants one for whatever reason, and now all of a sudden, I'm on a Latvian message board trying to see when the next shipment is coming. No one understands this principle better than Nintendo. It's become an integral part of their identity as a brand, especially in the last few years. But the root of the problem started in the 80s. Mario was the game franchise. Nintendo pretty much owned the home console industry, at least in North America. Brazil was off being Brazil. And, you know, in the same way we think of the Wii craze, the Toys to Life craze, the penny farthing craze. In the 80s, there was the Mario craze. Everything was Mario. They had Mario cereal. They had Mario TV shows, Mario movies, Mario lunchboxes, some other stuff that I probably shouldn't mention. Italian pride hadn't been this high since Julius and the boys were making salad. Let's go invade the Carthage! Wahoo! Yippee! Nintendo was cooking too with Super Mario Bros. 2, but they made it a little too spicy and they didn't want to bring it to the Western market because we're bad at games. So they took a completely different game and said, bam, you're Mario now. People didn't really have a good frame of reference for what kind of formula a Mario game had to follow. So even though this game is really nothing like Mario 1, it had the plumber, it had the jumping, boom, people are like, yeah, sure, we're on board, that's Mario. And so this game that wasn't even supposed to be a Mario game became the hot new item for the holiday season, out of stock everywhere. Even back in the innocent 80s, people were skeptical that these supply issues for Mario 2 were just a ploy to drive up demand.
Today, some people in the toy business suspect Nintendo's holding games back.
To which Nintendo replied,
"Shut up and eat your Mario cereal, peasant, cause you ain't seen nothing yet."
However, I will say that I think Nintendo was actually not doing it on purpose this time around. There was a global chip shortage at the time from mid-1988 to mid-1989, and the release of Mario 2 for the holiday season fell right in the thick of it. It's worth noting that Zelda 2 and other releases were affected by this as well, and I mean that doesn't rule it out being caused by, you know, artificial supply issues. However, I'm going to say that this was probably not the case. This was early Nintendo. Would they really be pulling the risk of doing these schemes? And the fact it timed up exactly with a chip shortage just seems like too big of a coincidence. But regardless, I think this taught Nintendo something about the power of hype. Now, this could have been a risk for Switch 2 as well. Chip shortages are always going to be a looming threat in some way, shape, or form due to demand constantly increasing, as well as global supply chain being affected by factors way beyond the video game industry. We just had a major chip shortage in 2023. You know, when that is mostly behind us, the risk is always there. Like, we've seen recent consoles be affected by these type of shortages, but the Switch 2 has seemed to have avoided this. Now, after the chip shortage in '88, there weren't too many huge supply chain issues with Nintendo. There was another chip shortage in the mid-90s, and the N64 had some minor supply issues at the end of the launch, but nothing really worth noting here. But that relatively good streak came to an end with another craze, the Wii. The Wii was such a phenomenon, and Nintendo is still reaping the benefits of consumer goodwill towards it to this day. Unlike in 1988, however, I was around for the Wii's launch, although I wasn't too cognitive then. You could argue I'm not now. My memories of it, you know, because of that aren't the most clear, but I have heard the legends from my older brother on what went down. Lines upon lines out of EB Games, Best Buy, Future Shop, Harvey's. I mean, who knows? Maybe they got a Wii in there. This time, though, it wasn't just parents and gamers looking for the console. It was the pensioners. I can't think of a demographic that wasn't interested in Wii. This is real footage of that uncontacted tribe off the coast of India playing Link's crossbow training. The Wii launched in 2006, and my brother couldn't find one until 2008 in some random store that's long since been out of business, all the way hidden in the back. What I've seen from people's recounts of the stock issues for the Wii suggests that my brother's story was a pretty typical one, that in the holiday season of 2008 is when people were actually able to get their consoles. But remember, the console came out in holiday 2006, so it took 2 years for these issues to be resolved.
Why is it still so hard to get your hands on a Wii?
Well, it's not so much supply as it is demand. As we've gone through this year and increased the supply periodically, we still can't seem to catch up with the demand.
Like, the PS5 took a while to actually become readily available. I remember I got mine in early 2022 after it released in late 2020, but we all know what was going on around that time to, affect that stock. Of course, I'm talking about my One Piece Burning Blood review! Back in 2006-2008, there wasn't really a good explanation for why the Wii supply struggled so much. From the articles I've read, everything from the assembly time to make a console to the way it was packaged to Great Recession was blamed. Of course, just like Mario 2 all the way back in 1988, people were thinking it was artificial stock issues to increase demand. I think this explanation is a bit more likely than it was for Mario 2, but I still don't give too much credence to it. By how long the shortage lasted, it would be hard to argue that Nintendo was purposely denying themselves more customers who would buy new game releases each month, new controllers. Would they really make people wait a whole 2 years to play Canada Hunt? Like, I get the argument that, hey, Nintendo will create a shortage initially to build up hype and then make more stock once the craze is in full effect. But the fact that Nintendo took so long in getting supply out means they missed a lot of opportunities to sell consoles when the craze was at its absolute highest. This would also explain why we all have memories of the Wii as this crazy phenomenon, a console everybody had, but the actual number of consoles sold is lower than a lot of consoles that didn't have a craze like this. Secondly, I think it's reasonable to assume Nintendo just genuinely underestimated how popular this new console would be for them. They were coming off of a pretty lackluster generation for themselves sales-wise, and at the time, it seemed like the Xbox 360, and especially the PS3, were just gonna dominate them in the market. The reason why that didn't happen is a variable that Nintendo definitely accounted for, but maybe not to the extent that it actually ended up helping them. The casual gaming audience. Those deodorant burning. I think it's fair to assume they didn't realize just how many casual gamers there were to jump on the Wii's bandwagon. Oh, they just didn't produce too many systems because they underestimated the ability of the casual audience to care that much out of the gate for Canada Hunt. And well, they didn't want to produce too many consoles and end up not being able to sell them, because we know that companies lose a lot of money on consoles themselves and make the money back up in the software. So if they're going to underestimate how many people are willing to buy it, then they're going to underestimate how many consoles they need to produce. This would have been the worst case scenario for Switch 2 in my opinion, but I think the fact that the original console was so successful means that Nintendo was expecting the sequel to be very, very popular at the beginning. But with a lot of people saying they were going to pass on the Switch 2 because of the price, I was worried that, hey, maybe Nintendo won't make a lot. So what happened on release day? We sure showed them, guys. Yeah, take that, corporate greed. But Nintendo knows quite a bit more than me. So I guess they figured it would be such a success despite the price increase, so they produced consoles accordingly. We've talked about the many scenarios in which the Switch 2 could have had supply issues. Looking back on Nintendo's supply issues of the past, and come to the conclusion that Nintendo likely didn't premeditate these issues, or at least didn't outright manufacture them. But let's jump forward to a more recent supply chain issue, one that many believe was artificially manufactured by Nintendo, including me. Amiibo / the classic consoles. Now I grouped these together because they were roughly from the same era, applied to the same demographic, and largely face the same kind of problems. However, I will prefix my point by saying there are differences in the supply issues of both, so let's start with Amiibo. Now, I've touched on this a little bit before in a previous video. I love that I have enough videos out now that I can say that. Amiibo were Nintendo's answers to a craze called Toys to Life, where you would use action figures to get characters in certain games. Toys to Life, like any collectible, had its rare figures and common ones. This is exactly what we've been talking about as an artificial supply issue. But I think the nature of figure collecting made it far less exclusionary than doing it with a game or a console. Like, you didn't need to have certain Skylanders in order to play. So everyone had different ones depending on whether they went to Toys R Us, EB Games, Zellers, or Harvey's. I mean, we gotta check Harvey's. Maybe they got Zook in there. Amiibo, however, at least at the time, felt like a more extreme version of this. Like, so many Amiibo were just nowhere, but Skylanders, on the other hand, always had a good variety available. Like with Amiibo, it was just Mario, Pikachu, Link peeing. This would be okay if you were in wolf form, but come on. This is one of the only supply chain issues Nintendo's had that I'm almost positive they manufactured artificially, as they knew toys to life were popular, so it's not like they were taken off guard by high demand. They were literally following a pre-existing trend. And there were no material shortages either. I do not recall the great plastic shortage of 2014, although the Kardashians were quite prominent then. Sorry, that's mean. I know Kim's a big fan of the channel. Now time for the classic consoles. First off was the NES Classic. Nintendo hasn't always been the best at capitalizing off of nostalgia, despite being tied to more players' nostalgia than any other game company. They usually don't put in the effort to milk it as much as they could. The Wii U era, however, was a time when Nintendo desperately needed more revenue streams because their home console was underperforming. So we saw things like their expansion into mobile gaming, a truly unhealthy amount of collector's edition 3DSs, Amiibo, and pandering! The NES Classic wasn't anything particularly special. NES games were widely available on the current hardware, but it was the presentation that made people go crazy. Little console with the little controllers. Actually, the controllers were normal size. Look at the packaging. Ooh, Nintendo fans are easy, please. Give us plastic, give us cardboard that reminds us of other cardboard, and we'll give you money. However, in a situation that slightly mirrors that of the Wii, it wasn't just Nintendo fans competing to buy these. There was the normal round of scalpers, yes, but also nostalgic Gen Xers. They weren't into games really anymore, but damn it, it was 2016 and people had money to burn. So these things were gone, and I mean, I have never seen a shortage quite like this. It was a fever. They were going for 5 times the asking price on eBay. I remember my friend telling me his coworker drove up to Sudbury because some random store had a restock leak. Like, that's crazy. The only reason someone should go up there is to see the big coin. But yeah, it was bonkers, and I don't just cuss for anything. So this could just be another case of Nintendo being overwhelmed by demand, right? No, because when the SNES Classic came out, it happened all over again. There is no way they should have been taken off guard again. The nostalgic Gen Xers in 2016 were fierce, sure, but a nostalgic millennial in 2017 is like the final boss of wasting money. Especially on nostalgia, ravaging through Hot Topics like they didn't have that much money to burn, to be honest, but it was years before the housing crisis, who even cares? Yes, I will finance this Franklin graphic tee in yearly installments. I can't even lie, that actually goes kind of hard. These were nearly as hard to find as the NES Classic. I say nearly because I actually found one back at a Walmart during Black Friday 2018. It was in high school then, so I only had so much money. I was debating between getting the SNES Classic or Starlink's Battle for Atlas, and a Star Fox crossover seemed like a bigger deal to me at the time. So... Since Amiibo and the classic consoles were novelty items deeply important to collectors and nostalgia foamers alike, Nintendo knew they could create artificial demand to make what should just be viewed as another Toys to Life line look like an ultra rare, super cool collectible item with resale potential, and make what usually sells at the bottom of a game aisle at Walmart look like a limited edition way to relive your youth, capture the magic of these old games, even though these old games have been readily available for 20 years. Have deodorant in a special box and have the stock be low, and see how fast Smash tournaments become more pleasant. Now, the reasons these products were likely made to be artificially scarce is because they were oversaturated products and they likely needed a gimmick to build up hype. At least to some extent, Nintendo fans can be relied on to buy whatever Nintendo makes. Nintendo could have done something similar to that with the Switch 2 to make people who are on the fence impulse buy it, like, hey, it's a more powerful Switch, like, I don't know if I need it, but uh-oh, it's in short supply. But I don't really know how compelling that is. This is their next generation console. It's really hard to present it as a novelty when most people know that it's going to be around for the next few years. Finally, the last supply issue we'll cover, the Switch 1. Okay, so this is probably the largest reason I want to make this video. The Switch 1 supply shortage and the quest to track one down is very tied to my deep personal relationship with this multinational Japanese company. It was a very memorable time for me as a fan. So instead of recounting the general experience of the shortage with some personal tidbits thrown in, I'd like to give you a bit of the opposites of that with my personal experience at the forefront and some tidbits about the general experience that most people had thrown in. You following me? Okay, so the Switch was revealed and released in my first year of high school. I actually had a quiz right before the reveal was supposed to take place. The quiz started at like 9:45 and the Switch reveal was supposed to be at 10, so I studied my butt off and got the quiz done within 5 minutes so I could watch the reveal. My GPA correlates directly with console reveal trailers. A few months later it came out and I assumed I would just be able to buy it, like how I bought every other, Nintendo console. But just like how Julius and the boys assumed Rome would never fall, I had no idea what was to come. See, I had had experienced stock issues with Nintendo before, like Amiibo, the NES Classic, but as I said, the main consoles were always available, at least for as long as I could remember at the time. Nintendo was in the mud during that era, so I figured, okay, I'll just buy it after school on March 3rd, you know, it's not a big deal, it wasn't available. I called every EB Games, every Best Buy, I think even Future Shop was still around then. I was really scraping the bottom of the barrel. I even went to Shoppers Drug Mart. Yo, when they had games, it was elite. I bought a new copy of Rhythm Heaven in like 2018 for 15 bucks. Brand new, sealed and everything. And before you ask, yes, it's on the resume. No, I got to stop distracting myself. Okay, so here I was, a Nintendo gremlin
Without my Nintendo Gold.
I completely stayed off the Switch side of social media. I couldn't bear to watch people enjoying their consoles. But I wasn't done. See, I was on ADHD meds at the time, which is supposed to help you lock in for work or school. But instead, I locked in on the Switch stock boards. I went on the Canadian Now Stock message board, and I remember I had a whole crew there. There was the dude from Winnipeg, there was the dude with the friend who worked at Amazon, there was Jeff. Ugh, little guy wants a Switch as well. On second thought, I think that might have been a different Jeff. So I literally, and I mean literally, checked the forum every 10 minutes. I gave myself breaks to sleep at night, you know, occasionally talk to people. But that's it, whether I was at school or home or out with friends. Okay, I wasn't out with friends much during this era. But I was gonna use the Switch to make friends.
Anyone wanna play Super Bomberman R with me?
Math grade actually dropped 15 marks during this period because math, for some reason, is actually harder to remember when you're not in math class. Don't worry though, my math grade recovered and I was able to have a high enough average to become a prestigious Nintendo YouTuber. So yeah, I was obsessed, okay? And this continued for weeks on end until March 30th, when the man with the Amazon friend came on the message board and said at 6 p.m. that day, Amazon would be getting some stock. And I mean, like, what reason did I have to believe this guy, right? He said his friend worked at Amazon, but he never proved it. Maybe he was working at a different Amazon. Maybe it was a pre-order for a new kind of tree. I don't know these things. But again, I was crazy obsessed, so I signed up for a Prime free trial just in case. And I had a strat. See, the red and blue model were more popular, so in order to make sure my order got in, I would go for the gray. I waited until 6 p.m., not sure if anything would actually come of it. And it was there! I was so excited I checked out and it went through, I ran up, gave all my family members a hug. Like I had just won the NBA Finals. And because it was Prime, it came the next day. So the stock issues were finally over for me. However, for everyone else, they seemed to continue well into the rest of the year. I remember being afraid to bring it anywhere, thinking someone was going to try to snatch it out of my bag. It wasn't until the holiday season when it seemed like the stock issues started to die down. My friends got one, and I saw people at the mall with one. So it became nearly a year before it was actually easy to find. Yeah, so that was the stock issues of the Switch 1. Why did they happen? I think it was a case of Nintendo very much not prepared for their own success. Like at this point, they knew how effective artificial scarcity can be, but the Switch was such a huge play for them, combining their handheld and home consoles into one device, one platform to market for, that I don't really know if they'd risk a play like that. This was a time where most people think Nintendo should have just stopped making hardware anyways and stick to games like Sega, like just publishing on other platforms. Could you imagine a Pokemon game running properly? I shiver at the thought. Anyways, I don't think Nintendo would purposely not capitalize on the release hype of a console this unique just because it worked with Amiibo. They had a lot to lose with a risk like that for very little proven benefit. But the Switch 1 turned out to be a huge success, and it seems the availability of the console at launch didn't really hinder or help that, at least compared to the multitude of other factors of why the Switch 1 did well. Okay, so we've talked about why the Switch 2 didn't face the same supply issues as these past consoles and games and figures, but let's talk about one last prevailing issue that most popular product launches face, and why the Switch 2 prevailing over said issue is likely the main reason why it didn't have as many supply issues. Scalpers, one of the many villains of gamer canon. Many retailers took measures with invitations to purchase and one item per person limits to ensure everyone had a fair shot, in a way they just didn't in times past. Switch 1's release had some measures like that, but not nearly enough. And before that, it used to be so bad. I remember people exploiting retailers in years past, even for not successful products. Who's gonna tell Susan? Even Nintendo, who offered the console directly from their website, took heavy measures to ensure fairness. Because if there's one thing they don't like, it's other people making money off their products. Or making things similar to their products. Or even people paying for the products but then playing them in a way they don't like. Nintendo just doesn't like you. But none of that matters, I guess, because the Switch 2 has had statistically the best launch of all time, and was still readily available post-launch. Maybe Nintendo has finally figured out how to fight supply issues, or maybe...
Okay, this next segment will be our last announcement. Please take a look.
Great recession.
We ain't seen nothing yet. Like, subscribe, bye!